You think you know everything about BTS? You think those 7 men from Seoul have shown every side of themselves on camera, on stage, on Weverse? Think again. Because behind the sold-out stadiums, behind the Billboard records, behind the perfectly choreographed smiles, there are stories that never made it to the official narrative. Stories told not by the members themselves, but by the women who stood close enough to see what the cameras never captured. We're talking real confessions, words that slipped out during interviews, variety shows, live broadcasts, and even personal social media moments from women who worked with them, grew up with them, trained beside them, and in some cases, were romantically linked to them. Now here's where it gets interesting. What did a famous actress accidentally reveal about one member's private personality that left fans completely stunned? Which member's own sister exposed a habit so unexpected that even Big Hit couldn't spin it? And whose name was whispered alongside a global idol in a confession so subtle that only eagle-eyed armies caught it, but when they did, the internet nearly broke. From number 7 all the way down to number 1, each revelation on this list hits different. Some will make you laugh, some will make you rethink everything you thought you knew, and at least one, trust me on this, will genuinely shake you. So if you're ready to hear what the women closest to BTS have actually said when the world wasn't fully paying attention, buckle up, Army. This list is not what you're expecting. Let's get into it. Number 7. J-Hope. His sister exposed the man behind the sunshine. You know him as the human embodiment of pure energy. The guy who walks into a room and instantly turns the vibe up by 1,000%. Young Hoseok, or as the world calls him, J-Hope, has built an entire legacy on being BTS's mood maker, the eternal sunshine, the one who screams, "I'm your hope, you're my hope," and somehow makes 80,000 people in a stadium believe it with every fiber of their being. From the Gwangju kid who dominated underground street dance battles to the global superstar who dropped Jack in the Box and proved he could stand alone as a serious artist, J-Hope's public image has always been wrapped in this unbreakable layer of positivity. And honestly, most fans never questioned it. Why would they? Every V-Live, every Bangtan bomb, every behind-the-scenes clip showed the same thing, a man who seemed almost incapable of being anything other than bright. But then his older sister, young Jiwoo, started talking. And what she revealed didn't just crack the image, it completely reframed everything ARMYs thought they understood about the real Hoseok behind closed doors. Young Jiwoo isn't some random relative riding the BTS wave. She's carved out her own identity as a legitimate fashion and lifestyle influencer in South Korea, with a following that respects her for her own taste, her own aesthetic, her own voice. But inevitably, because she's the older sister of one of the most famous men on the planet, the questions always circle back to him. And over the years, through Instagram stories, through interviews, through subtle comments dropped on live streams and variety content, Jiwoo has painted a portrait of her younger brother that is almost the polar opposite of what the world sees on stage. According to her, the real young Hoseok at home is quiet. Not just a little bit calmer than on stage, quiet, genuinely, deeply reserved. She's described moments where Hoseok comes home after schedules and barely speaks. Not out of rudeness, not out of exhaustion in the dramatic sense, but because his natural default is actually someone who processes internally, who retreats into his own thoughts, who doesn't need to fill every silence with noise. Let that sit for a moment. The man whose literal brand is being the loudest spark of joy in any room is naturally an introvert. And it doesn't stop there. Jiwoo has also shared that Hoseok is almost obsessively meticulous. We're not talking about normal tidiness. We're talking about a level of organization that borders on ritualistic. His room, his belongings, his personal space, everything has a designated place, and if something is even slightly out of order, it genuinely bothers him. She's mentioned how growing up, his side of their shared spaces was always immaculate while she was the messier sibling. Fans had already caught glimpses of this through BTS content. The way J-Hope's studio at HYBE is always spotless, the way he organizes his clothes by color and category, the way he folds things with military precision. But hearing it confirmed by someone who literally grew up in the same house, who saw him before the fame, before the persona, before J-Hope even existed, that hits different. It tells you that this isn't a habit he developed as a celebrity trying to maintain order in a chaotic idol life. This is who young Hoseok has been since he was a kid in Gwangju, long before big hit entertainment ever knew his name. What makes Jiwoo's confessions so impactful isn't just the content, it's the contrast. Because she clearly adores her brother. There's never a hint of jealousy, never a trace of resentment in how she talks about him. When she reveals these quieter, more serious sides of Hoseok, she does it with warmth, with pride, with the kind of love that says, I want the world to know the real him, not just the character. And that's what shook ARMYs the most. It wasn't scandalous. It wasn't negative. It was simply real. The realization that J-Hope's sunshine persona isn't fake, but it is a performance. A conscious, deliberate choice he makes every single day to bring light to the people around him, even when his natural state might be to sit quietly in a room and think. That takes more effort than most fans ever considered. It means every "I'm your hope" was never just a catchphrase, it was an act of emotional labor, a gift he chose to give. Jiwoo's words turned J-Hope from a character into a complete human being in the eyes of millions, and, honestly, it made ARMYs love him even more. Not for the sunshine, but for the man who decided to become it. And Jiwoo herself? She never asked for the spotlight that comes with being a BTS sibling. But she handled it with a grace that earned her genuine respect from the fandom. She didn't exploit the connection. She didn't drop bombshells for clout. She simply shared honest, loving observations about her brother, and in doing so, gave ARMYs a window into a version of J-Hope that no camera crew, no variety show PD, no concert stage could ever capture. The quiet Hoseok. The serious Hoseok. The one who cleans when he's stressed, who thinks before he speaks, who carries the weight of being everyone's hope while sometimes just wanting to be himself. That's the confession. And that's why it landed so hard. But if you think a sister revealing her brother's hidden quiet side is enough to shake the fandom, wait until you hear what was said about the next member on this list. Because this one didn't come from family. It came from someone the industry never expected to speak up, and when she did, the reaction was absolute chaos. Number 6. V. The love that broke the internet and silenced millions. Kim Taehyung has always been an enigma. Even within a group as meticulously documented as BTS, where practically every waking moment has been filmed, streamed, or photographed, V somehow managed to remain the most unreadable member. The deep voice that doesn't match the youthful face. The fashion choices that oscillate between Gucci runway elegance and vintage grandpa aesthetic. The way he can stare directly into a camera and make you feel like he's simultaneously inviting you in and locking you out. For years, ARMYs tried to decode him, analyzing every gesture, every cryptic Instagram post, every Weverse comment for clues about who Kim Taehyung really is when the world isn't watching. And for the longest time, Taehyung gave them almost nothing. His private life was a fortress. While other idols occasionally slipped, occasionally let details leak through the cracks, V maintained an almost supernatural level of secrecy about his personal relationships. Until the photos dropped. And when they did, the woman at the center of the storm was none other than Jennie Kim of Blackpink, and the shockwave that followed was unlike anything the K-pop industry had ever witnessed. Let's rewind to understand why this hit so hard. It was 2022 when images began surfacing online, not from paparazzi, not from tabloid journalists, but leaked through channels that suggested someone with access to private material had deliberately made them public. The photos showed V and Jennie together in settings that were unmistakably intimate, not in the scandalous sense, but in the deeply personal sense. Casual outings. Moments that looked like two people simply existing together, without the weight of their public identities. For anyone else on the planet, these would have been unremarkable snapshots. But for Kim Taehyung of BTS and Jennie Kim of Blackpink, two individuals who sit at the absolute apex of the global K-pop ecosystem, these images were a nuclear detonation. Within hours, the photos had circulated across every major social media platform on Earth. Twitter servers buckled. Weverse was flooded. Korean news outlets ran breaking coverage as if reporting a geopolitical event. And armies, millions upon millions of them, were forced to confront something they had either never considered or had actively refused to consider. V had a romantic life that existed entirely outside of their awareness, and the woman in it was one of the most famous female idols in the world. What made this revelation so seismic wasn't just the identities involved, it was the collision of two of the most fiercely protective fandoms in history. ARMY and Blink, BTS and Blackpink. Two groups that had coexisted in the K-pop space with a complicated mixture of mutual respect and underlying rivalry. The idea that a member of BTS and a member of Blackpink could be romantically linked was the kind of scenario that fanfiction writers dreamed about, but that the real-world industry treated as unthinkable. The parasocial implications alone were staggering. Both V and Jennie had been positioned by their respective companies, HYBE and YG Entertainment, as figures whose appeal was partially built on emotional availability, on the unspoken promise that the connection fans felt was special, exclusive, irreplaceable. A confirmed relationship didn't just challenge that illusion, it shattered it entirely. And the reactions reflected that rupture. Some armies rallied behind Taehyung with genuine support, posting messages of love and acceptance, arguing that his happiness should matter more than any fan's possessive fantasy. Others fell into denial, constructing elaborate theories that the photos were fabricated, edited, taken out of context. And a smaller, but painfully vocal minority directed genuine hostility toward Jennie herself. A reaction that exposed the ugliest undercurrents of idol culture and the toxic ownership mentality that festers within certain corners of fandom spaces. But here's what most casual observers missed, and what made this story resonate far beyond gossip headlines. The eventual acknowledgement from both agencies, when it quietly came, without dramatic press conferences or formal statements, but through the kind of non-denial that in Korean entertainment culture speaks louder than any official confirmation, represented something genuinely significant. It was one of the first times in modern K-pop that two top-tier idols from competing companies had their relationship enter the public record without either party being destroyed by the fallout. Think about the history. Think about how many K-pop dating revelations have ended in public apologies, tearful press conferences, career damage, even group disbandments. The industry had spent decades conditioning idols to treat their personal lives as liabilities, something to be hidden, denied, and, if exposed, atoned for as if it were a crime. V and Jennie's situation, while messy and painful in many ways, quietly challenged that entire framework. Neither of them apologized. Neither of them issued statements begging for forgiveness from fans. And in that silence, in that refusal to perform shame for something as fundamentally human as loving someone, there was a confession more powerful than any words could have delivered. What struck many observers, industry analysts, cultural commentators, and thoughtful fans alike, was what this revealed about Taehyung specifically. Here was a man who had spent his entire career carefully constructing boundaries between his public and private selves. A man who, unlike some of his groupmates who occasionally shared glimpses of vulnerability about loneliness or personal struggles, almost never let the mask slip when it came to matters of the heart. And yet he had been living this entire parallel existence, nurturing a relationship with someone who understood the exact same pressures, the exact same fishbowl existence, the exact same sacrifice of personal freedom that comes with being a global idol. In choosing Jennie, if choice is even the right word for something as unpredictable as human connection, Taehyung had found perhaps the only type of person on earth who could truly understand what his life felt like from the inside. And Jennie, for her part, had done the same. Two people trapped in the most beautiful, most suffocating cages the entertainment industry could build, somehow finding each other through the bars. There's something poetic in that. Something that, once the initial shock faded and the noise quieted, even the most skeptical armies had to admit was deeply, undeniably human. The confession here wasn't a single statement or a single interview. It was the entire revelation itself, the fact that Kim Taehyung, the most guarded member of the most famous group in the world, had let someone in. And that someone happened to be a woman whose own fame meant that the secret could never have stayed hidden forever. That vulnerability, whether voluntary or forced, told armies more about the real V than a decade of Bangtan bombs ever could. But if the revelation about V's love life sent shockwaves through the fandom, what's coming at number 5 might genuinely leave you speechless, because this confession didn't come from a romantic partner. It came from a woman inside the industry who worked alongside one member so closely that what she revealed carries a weight that no dating scandal ever could. Number 5. Jimin. The dance teacher who cried watching what he became. Park Jimin doesn't just perform, he possesses. When that man steps onto a stage, something shifts in the atmosphere. The air gets heavier. The lights seem to bend toward him. Whether it's the controlled ferocity of Filter, the devastating vulnerability of Lie, or the effortless magnetism that made Like Crazy the first solo track by a Korean soloist to debut at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, Jimin operates on a frequency that most performers spend entire careers trying to reach and never do. He is, by virtually every measurable standard, one of the most captivating stage artists of his generation. And because he makes it look so fluid, so instinctive, so natural, it's dangerously easy to assume that it's always been this way. That Jimin simply arrived in the world preloaded with this gift. That confidence, that grace, that ability to command attention with a single glance, surely it was always there. But the women who knew him before the world did? They tell a very different story. And what they revealed peeled back a layer of Park Jimin that no choreography video, no fancam, no concert performance could ever show you, a layer soaked in pain, obsession, and a perfectionism so extreme it nearly broke him. Before BTS, before Big Hit, before Seoul even entered his universe, Park Jimin was a student at Busan High School of Arts, majoring in contemporary dance. And he wasn't just any student, he was the top of his class. Number 1. The kid that teachers pointed to and said, "That's what dedication looks like." His female contemporary dance instructor, who had trained dozens of students over the years, would later recall in interviews and media appearances that Jimin stood out not because he was the most naturally gifted dancer she'd ever seen, but because he was the hardest working. And there's a critical distinction there that most people miss. Natural talent is a lottery. Work ethic is a choice. And Jimin chose violence against his own limits every single day. His teacher described how he would stay after every class, long after the other students had packed up and gone home, repeating sequences over and over until his body physically couldn't continue. She talked about how he would record himself, watch the footage back, and fixate on flaws that were invisible to everyone else in the room. A micro-hesitation in a transition. A finger not fully extended. A landing that was 1 degree off from what he envisioned. These weren't mistakes. To any normal observer, his execution was flawless. But to Jimin, they were failures. And that word, failure, lived inside him like a parasite, feeding on every moment of self-doubt and growing stronger with each achievement, because the bar kept moving higher. When Jimin transferred to Korean Arts High School in Seoul after being accepted into Big Hit Entertainment as a trainee, the women around him, female staff members, stylists, vocal coaches, and fellow trainees, began witnessing something that would later become one of the most heartbreaking open secrets in BTS's history. Jimin's perfectionism wasn't limited to dance. It had metastasized into his relationship with his own body. During the early years of BTS, as the group fought for survival in an industry that chews up rookies and spits them out without a second thought, Jimin became consumed with the idea that he wasn't good enough, not talented enough, not slim enough, not attractive enough. Female stylists who worked with BTS during the dark and wild and the most beautiful moment in life eras would later quietly share, through anonymous industry accounts and corroborated fan interactions, that Jimin would sometimes arrive at schedules visibly weakened from not eating. Not dieting. Not eating. There's a difference. And these women, professionals whose job it was to make idols look their best, found themselves in the impossible position of watching a young man in his late teens and early 20s slowly hollowing himself out in pursuit of a standard of perfection that didn't exist anywhere except inside his own head. What makes these confessions so devastating is the context. This was happening while BTS was still climbing. while Jimin was delivering performances that were making audiences gasp, while fan cams of him were going viral with millions of views, while fans across the world were calling him one of the most beautiful men they'd ever seen. He was receiving all of this external validation, mountains of it, oceans of it, and none of it was reaching the part of him that needed it most. The women who worked closest to him saw this disconnect in real time. They saw a performer who could make 70,000 people scream his name and then walk backstage and ask a stylist if his jawline looked too round. They saw a dancer who could execute moves that left professional choreographers speechless and then spend the van ride home watching his own footage with visible distress on his face. His female vocal coaches reportedly struggled with this too. Jimin's voice, a uniquely high and emotionally textured instrument, was perpetually being pushed by its owner toward an unreachable ideal. He would practice until his voice cracked, rest briefly, and then practice again. Female trainers and coaches who worked with him during this period described a relentless cycle that was equal parts inspiring and terrifying to witness. And then there's the moment that encapsulates everything. When BTS began performing on major stages, the Mama Awards, the Melon Music Awards, eventually the Billboard Music Awards and beyond, Jimin's former contemporary dance teacher from Busan watched from afar. By then, she had seen her former top student transform from a quiet, driven teenager into a global phenomenon. And in interviews, she didn't talk about pride in the way you'd expect. She talked about crying. Not tears of simple happiness or teacher's pride, but tears that carried the weight of knowing what it cost him. Because she was one of the first people who saw the obsession take root. She was there when the seed of "I'm not enough" was planted in a boy who was already more than enough by every objective measure. She watched it grow in her classroom, saw it follow him to Seoul, and then watched from a distance as it played out on the world's biggest stages. When she saw Jimin perform, she saw the brilliance that the world saw, but she also saw the ghost of the teenager who used to cry in her practice room because he couldn't land a move that he'd already landed perfectly 10 times in a row. That duality, the glory and the agony existing in the same body, in the same breath, is what made her tears so complex. And when her words reached armies through media coverage, the fandom experienced a collective reckoning. Because suddenly, every flawless performance wasn't just a display of talent, it was evidence of a war that Park Jimin fights against himself every time he steps into the light. Jimin himself has been courageously open about these struggles in later years. Through his solo album, Face, through candid conversations on Weverse and in documentaries, he's acknowledged the eating issues, the body dysmorphia, the relentless self-criticism. But hearing it from him is one thing. Hearing it confirmed, detailed, and emotionally expanded upon by the women who stood beside him during the darkest chapters, the teacher who saw it begin, the stylists who saw it escalate, the coaches who tried to tell him he was enough while knowing he couldn't hear them, that transforms information into testimony. And testimony carries a weight that no self-disclosure, no matter how honest, can fully replicate. These women didn't just witness Jimin's struggle. They held space for it. They worried about him when the cameras were off and the fans were gone. And their confessions gave armies the complete picture of what it truly costs to be Park Jimin, the most beautiful performance hiding the most painful battle. But if the story of Jimin's hidden pain left you speechless, the next entry on this list will take you somewhere entirely unexpected, because the woman who spoke up about this member didn't reveal vulnerability. She revealed a side so shockingly cold and calculated that armies didn't know whether to be impressed or disturbed. Number 4 is coming, and trust me, you're not ready. Number 4. Jungkook. The boy who couldn't even look at women has a secret nobody expected. There is a version of Jungkook that the current generation of armies, the ones who discovered him through 7 topping every chart on the planet, through Standing Next to You, where he moved like a man who owned every inch of the stage and every heartbeat in the arena, through those solo-era visuals that radiated a confidence so magnetic it felt almost dangerous, will never fully comprehend. Because before there was this Jungkook, before the world's most streamed Korean solo artist, before the man who could lock eyes with a camera and make millions forget how to breathe, There was a 15-year-old boy from Busan who literally could not make eye contact with a woman without looking like he wanted the earth to open up and swallow him whole. And the women who were there during those early years, the female MCs, the variety show hosts, the guest celebrities, the staff members who watched this kid navigate the terrifying landscape of the Korean entertainment industry. They carry a version of Jungkook's story that is so radically different from what exists today that it almost feels like they're describing a completely different human being. And when they talked about it, ARMYs didn't just find it cute. They found it revelatory. Let's go back to 2013. BTS had just debuted with No More Dream, and they were nobodies. Not underdogs in the romantic, retrospective sense that fans like to mythologize, actual nobodies. A group from a small company that most industry insiders had already written off. And Jungkook, the magne, was barely 15 years old. He had left his family in Busan, moved to Seoul alone at an age when most kids are worrying about homework and friendships, and was suddenly thrust into a world of cameras, schedules, and public appearances that would overwhelm most adults. And it showed. On early variety show appearances, female hosts and MCs quickly noticed something unusual about the youngest BTS member. While the other members, especially the Hyungs like Jin and RM, could handle conversation, banter, and the performative social dynamics of Korean television with varying degrees of comfort, Jungkook would physically shut down in the presence of women. Not metaphorically. Physically. His shoulders would tense. His eyes would drop to the floor. His voice, already soft, would shrink to barely a whisper. If a female MC directed a question at him, he would often defer to an older member or respond in fragments so short they barely qualified as answers. And if a female celebrity sat next to him on a panel, the space between them might as well have been an ocean for how rigidly he maintained distance. Female hosts from this era would later recount these moments with a mixture of amusement and genuine tenderness. One recurring observation that multiple women in the industry shared through interviews, variety show callbacks, and behind-the-scenes commentary was that Jungkook's shyness wasn't the typical idol modesty that companies coach into their trainees. It wasn't performative humility designed to make him seem more approachable or innocent. It was real. Painfully, transparently real. These women could see the discomfort radiating off him. They could see a teenager who was extraordinarily gifted at performing on stage, but who had almost zero experience interacting with women in casual social settings. Remember, Jungkook entered Big Hit as a trainee at 13. His formative adolescent years, the years when most people figure out how to talk to the opposite sex through the awkward trial and error of school life and social gatherings, were spent in a practice room. He was learning choreography instead of learning conversation. He was perfecting vocal runs instead of navigating the utterly mundane but crucial social skill of being comfortable around women. The entertainment industry robbed him of that developmental window, and the deficit was visible to every woman who interacted with him professionally during BTS's rookie years. The fandom even coined a term for it, Yoja allergy, literally woman allergy, and it became one of the most enduring memes in ARMY culture. Compilations of Jungkook freezing, flinching, or going statue still whenever a woman got too close racked up millions of views on YouTube. Fans found it adorable, endearing, a charming quirk that humanized this impossibly talented teenager. But for the women who experienced it firsthand, the MCs who had to work around his silence, the female guests who felt his discomfort and tried to put him at ease, the staff members who watched him struggle with something that should have been simple, it was more complicated than cute. It was a reminder of how much these young idols sacrifice by entering the industry so early. Behind the viral clips and the fan edits set to romantic music, there was a real boy who was genuinely, deeply uncomfortable in social situations that his peers outside the industry would have considered completely normal. And these women recognized that. Several female industry figures who interacted with early-era BTS have spoken about how they instinctively adopted a protective, almost maternal approach with Jungkook, giving him space, not pushing for interaction. Letting him observe rather than participate until he felt safe enough to engage. They saw not just a shy idol, but a child navigating an adult world with incomplete tools. And then the transformation happened. And this is where the confessions from women in his professional orbit shift from tender to astonished. Because Jungkook didn't just grow out of his shyness, he detonated it. The evolution wasn't gradual in the way most people mature. It was seismic. Female choreographers who worked with BTS during the Love Yourself and Map of the Soul eras began noticing a different energy in Jungkook. The teenager who couldn't maintain eye contact was becoming a performer who weaponized eye contact. Female creative directors involved in BTS's visual campaigns reported that Jungkook started arriving at concept meetings not just prepared, but with his own ideas, assertive, specific, sometimes challenging the direction that senior professionals had proposed. And he did it not with arrogance, but with a quiet, immovable certainty that took people by surprise precisely because they still carried the memory of the boy who could barely speak in a room with a woman present. One female producer who worked peripherally on projects connected to his solo material would later describe the experience as whiplash. Because the gap between the Jungkook she'd heard about from colleagues who knew him as a rookie and the Jungkook sitting across from her in a studio making decisive creative calls felt like two entirely different careers, two entirely different lifetimes. When Jungkook released 7 featuring Latto in July 2023, and it debuted at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, the song's concept, playful, flirtatious, dripping with the kind of easy confidence that only comes from someone who is genuinely comfortable in their own skin, stood as the most visceral evidence of how far he'd traveled. The explicit version of that track had Jungkook singing about desire with a directness that would have been physically impossible for the boy who once turned crimson because a female MC touched his arm on a variety show. And then came Standing Next to You, with choreography and visuals that channeled Michael Jackson and Usher, performances that oozed a sensuality so natural it seemed like it had always been there. Female backup dancers who performed with him during his solo promotions spoke about being genuinely surprised by how completely at ease he was. Not performing ease, being at ease. Laughing between takes, making conversation without hesitation, creating a rehearsal environment where the energy flowed naturally instead of being weighed down by the tension they'd half expected based on the legendary stories of his early shyness. For these women, working with the 2023 Jungkook was a revelation. They were witnessing the finished product of a metamorphosis that had taken a full decade, and the contrast between where he started and where he arrived was so extreme that it almost defied belief. What makes these collective confessions from the women across Jungkook's career so powerful is the arc they reveal. This isn't a story about a shy boy who became confident. It's a story about a human being who entered an industry that demanded everything from him before he was ready, who lost crucial years of normal social development, who carried visible discomfort as a public figure for years, and who, through sheer force of will, through relentless work on himself as a person, and not just as a performer, rebuilt himself into someone unrecognizable from the teenager he used to be. The women who saw both versions, the frozen boy and the commanding man, are the only ones who truly understand the magnitude of that journey. And when their words reach armies, when those stories circulate through fan communities and interviews and retrospective documentaries, they don't just add context. They rewrite the narrative entirely. Because the golden magne isn't golden because he was born perfect. He's golden because he forged himself in fire, and the women who stood close enough to feel the heat are the ones brave enough to tell you what it actually looked like. Number 3, Suga. I revealed the man nobody was supposed to see. Min Yoongi built his entire public identity on one very specific energy, and that energy is ice. Cold, unbothered, allergic to sentimentality, the type of man who could sit in the middle of a chaotic BTS group interview, say 3 devastating words, and leave everyone else scrambling to recover. The savage Min Yoongi persona isn't just a fan nickname, it's become an archetype in K-pop culture. The rapper who doesn't smile unless he means it. The producer who shuts himself in his studio for days and emerges only when the music is finished, not a second before. The guy who once said on camera that his ideal day off is doing absolutely nothing, alone, in silence, and meant every syllable with the conviction of a man reciting a personal creed. From his underground days in Daegu, where he rapped under the name Gloss and fought for recognition in a scene that didn't hand anything to anyone, to his August D mixtapes that peeled back layers of depression, anxiety, and raw fury with a lyrical precision that made grown critics flinch. Yoongi has always projected an image of emotional armor so thick that trying to penetrate it felt pointless. And honestly, ARMYs loved it. They loved the contrast between him and the more outwardly emotional members. They loved the compilations of him shutting down interviewers with a single deadpan stare. They loved the myth of the untouchable Min Yoongi. But then IU sat down and talked about what it was actually like to work with him. And every single brick in that carefully constructed wall cracked. In May 2020, IU released 8, a track produced by Suga that arrived during one of the darkest periods the Korean entertainment industry had ever endured. The song wasn't born from a casual collaboration request or a label-driven business arrangement. It emerged from grief. Real, visceral, unprocessable grief. The Korean entertainment world had been rocked by a string of devastating losses, Sully, Guhara, and others whose names became synonymous with the brutal human cost of fame in an industry that often values image over well-being. IU, who had been personally close to Sully, was carrying a weight that no amount of public composure could fully conceal. And Suga, though he didn't broadcast it with the same visibility, was navigating his own relationship with loss, with the fragility of life, with the question of what it means to keep creating when the people around you are breaking. When IU approached the collaboration, or when the collaboration found its way into existence through the organic channels of mutual respect and shared emotional terrain, what unfolded in the studio was something neither of them had entirely expected. And when IU later spoke about the experience, her words didn't just add to the public understanding of Suga, they fundamentally rewrote it. IU described a Min Yoongi that the savage compilations and the stoic interview clips would never in a million years prepare you for. She talked about a producer who didn't just want to make a hit song, who, in fact, seemed almost disinterested in whether the song charted or trended, but who was consumed by the need to get the emotional truth of the track exactly right. She described sessions where Yoongi would stop everything because a single melodic phrase didn't carry the precise shade of sadness he was hearing in his head. Not the notes, the emotion embedded in the notes. The way a particular vocal run might sound technically perfect but feel emotionally hollow. The way a production choice might be sonically impressive but distract from the raw human vulnerability that he believed the song demanded. IU, a veteran artist with over a decade of industry experience and a discography that spans virtually every genre Korean pop has explored, admitted that working with Suga surprised her. Not because of his technical ability, his reputation as a producer preceded him, and she expected excellence. What surprised her was his emotional investment. The depth of feeling he brought into a room that, based on his public persona, he should have entered with clinical detachment and professional distance. Instead, she found a man who cared almost too much. A man for whom music wasn't a product to be manufactured, but a living thing that needed to breathe with honesty, or it had no right to exist at all. And here's what made IU's confession land like a sledgehammer on the collective consciousness of the ARMY fandom. This wasn't just any woman saying Suga is secretly emotional. This was IU. The nation's sweetheart. The most respected female solo artist in the history of Korean popular music. A woman whose opinion carries a weight in the industry that very few human beings on Earth can match. When IU says something about a collaborator, people don't just listen, they recalibrate their entire understanding of that person. And what IU was saying, without ever being dramatic or performative about it, was that the real Min Yoongi is soft. Not soft in a weak sense, soft in the way that only genuinely strong people can afford to be. Soft in the way that allows someone to sit with grief instead of running from it. Soft in the way that hears a note and feels its emotional temperature before evaluating its musical accuracy. The kind of softness that is, paradoxically, the foundation of everything that makes his music so devastatingly powerful. Because you cannot write The Last, a song about suicidal ideation and clinical depression, from a place of ice. You cannot produce 8, a song about missing people who are never coming back, from behind emotional armor. Those works require a creator who is willing to feel everything, to let the pain pass through them unfiltered, and to somehow transmute it into sound before it destroys them. And IU, having sat across from that creator in a studio and watched the process unfold in real time, understood this in a way that no fan, no matter how dedicated, ever could from the outside. What amplified the impact of IU's revelation was its collision with everything else ARMYs knew, or thought they knew, about Yoongi's relationship with vulnerability. This is a man who has been startlingly transparent about his mental health struggles in his music. The August D trilogy, August D, D2, and D-Day constitutes one of the most brutally honest autobiographical works in modern popular music, spanning years of depression, the physical pain of a shoulder injury that threatened his career, the guilt of success, and the exhausting process of learning to accept himself as a complete human being rather than a collection of achievements and traumas. Fans had always engaged with this vulnerability through the filter of art, lyrics on a page, performances on a screen, metaphors wrapped in beats and melodies. But IU's words stripped away the artistic filter. She wasn't talking about Yoongi's music. She was talking about Yoongi the person, sitting in a chair, making decisions about a song, and revealing through those decisions a level of emotional awareness that his public persona works overtime to deny. The savage persona isn't fake. Yoongi is genuinely blunt, genuinely introverted, genuinely uninterested in small talk and social performance. But it's not the whole story. It's the shield, not the man. And IU held up a mirror that showed the man behind the shield, even if only for a moment, and in that reflection, millions of ARMYs saw something they hadn't fully grasped before. The ripple effects of IU's candor extended beyond fandom spaces. Music industry commentators pointed to 8 and its surrounding narrative as a case study in how collaboration can reveal artistic dimensions that solo work sometimes conceals. Yoongi's own projects, as deeply personal as they are, still pass through his editorial control. He decides what the audience sees, how much vulnerability gets released, where the emotional boundaries are drawn. But in a collaboration with someone like IU, someone whose artistry operates at a parallel level of intensity and honesty, those boundaries become negotiable. IU's presence in the creative process drew out aspects of Suga's emotional landscape that he might never have voluntarily displayed. And her willingness to speak openly about what she witnessed turned a private studio experience into a public revelation that permanently altered the fandom's relationship with Yoongi's complexity. After IU spoke, the Savage Yoongi compilations still circulated, but they hit differently. Every deadpan remark, every emotionless stare, every "I don't care" now carried an asterisk. Because somewhere behind that expression was the man IU described. The man who stopped a recording session because a melody didn't feel sad enough. The man who cared so profoundly about getting grief right that he turned a 3-minute pop song into an emotional monument. The man who is, beneath every layer of defense he's ever constructed, exactly the kind of person who feels too much and has simply learned to hide it well enough to survive. But if IU's words cracked the armor of the most guarded member in BTS, the next confession on this list doesn't just crack armor, it melts it entirely. Because number 2 involves a woman whose words about this member were so unexpectedly intimate, so loaded with a warmth that no one anticipated, that when ARMYs heard them, the entire fandom collectively held its breath. You're going to want to hear this one. Number 2, Jin, the woman who knew him before fame, said something that silenced everyone. Seokjin occupies a space in BTS that no other member could fill, not because of vocal range, not because of dance ability, not because of rap flow or production credits, but because of something far harder to quantify and infinitely more rare in the entertainment industry. Stability. Emotional gravity. The quiet, immovable center that holds everything in orbit while spinning fast enough to tear apart. Jin is the eldest. The young. The man who was already an adult when some of his groupmates were still figuring out who they were as teenagers. And for over a decade, he carried that role with a consistency so absolute that most ARMYs, if they're being honest, probably took it for granted. The dad jokes. The windshield wiper laugh. The self-appointed worldwide handsome title delivered with a wink that somehow made arrogance feel like a warm hug. Jin became the comic relief, the mood stabilizer, the member whose chaos was always safe, always warm, always precisely calibrated to make the room lighter without ever making it less meaningful. But when the women who knew him, not as an idol, not as a global superstar, but as a regular human being before any of this existed, started talking about who Kim Seokjin actually is beneath all the laughter, what they described wasn't just heartwarming. It was disorienting. Because the confession wasn't that Jin is secretly different from his public self. The confession was that he's exactly the same. And in an industry engineered to transform people beyond recognition, that might be the most shocking revelation on this entire list. Before BTS, before Big Hit, before the name Kim Seokjin appeared on a single fan's radar anywhere in the world, there was a boy walking through the streets near Konkuk University, where he was majoring in art and acting. Living the kind of unremarkable student life that millions of young Koreans experience. Going to class. Eating at cheap restaurants. Hanging out with friends who had no idea that the tall, broad-shouldered guy cracking terrible jokes over a bowl of ramen would one day sell out stadiums on 5 continents. And among those friends, among those classmates, there were women, female peers at Konkuk who sat next to him in lecture halls, who partnered with him on university projects, who ate lunch with him in campus cafeterias, who knew a version of Seokjin that existed before the machine of idol culture got its hands on him. And when BTS exploded, when their classmates' face started appearing on billboards and magazine covers and international news broadcasts, these women did what anyone would do. They watched. They compared. They asked the question that every person who knew a celebrity before fame inevitably asks, did he change? And the answer, delivered consistently across multiple accounts shared through Korean online communities, university alumni networks, and the kind of organic word-of-mouth testimony that can't be manufactured by a PR team, was no. Emphatically, almost bewilderingly, no. Female classmates from Konkuk University described a Seokjin who was, even back then, exactly the person the world would come to know. The humor was already there, not polished idol variety humor designed for camera consumption, but the relentless, groan-inducing dad joke energy that would later become his signature. He was the guy in the friend group who would say something so corny that everyone would simultaneously laugh and threaten to leave. The kindness was already there too. Multiple women from his university days recalled a man who remembered small details about people's lives. Not in the performative way that socially ambitious people catalog information to use later, but in the genuine way that suggests he was actually listening when someone talked about their day, their problems, their small victories. He would ask follow-up questions about things people mentioned weeks earlier. He would notice when someone in the group seemed quiet and find a way to include them without making it obvious. He treated the cafeteria ajumma with the same warmth he treated his closest friends. These aren't dramatic revelations. They're not scandalous or explosive. But in their ordinariness lies something extraordinary, because they describe a man whose fundamental character was fully formed before fame ever entered the equation. The world didn't shape Kim Seokjin. Kim Seokjin entered the world already complete. And then there's the street casting story, and the woman whose observation at that moment adds an almost cinematic layer to Jin's origin narrative. Before Big Hit, SM Entertainment, the largest, most prestigious entertainment company in South Korea at the time, spotted Jin on the street and tried to recruit him based purely on his physical appearance. The casting agent, a woman whose job was literally to identify potential idols based on visual first impressions, saw something in Seokjin that stopped her in her tracks. This was SM. The company behind TVXQ, Super Junior, EXO, Girls' Generation. They didn't approach random college students unless the visual impact was undeniable. And yet here was this acting student, not trying to be noticed, not dressed for attention, not performing for anyone, who radiated something so striking that a professional talent scout felt compelled to intervene in his ordinary day and offer him a path to stardom. Jin declined SM. He eventually found his way to Big Hit through a separate audition process, choosing a company that was, at the time, a fraction of SM's size and prestige. But the street casting moment itself became part of BTS mythology, and the woman who approached him that day, whose professional instinct told her that this face, this presence, this energy belonged on a stage, inadvertently set in motion a chain of events that would alter the landscape of global popular culture. She didn't just see a handsome man. She saw something that transcended aesthetics, a quality that the camera would later fall in love with not because of symmetry or bone structure, but because of the warmth that lived behind the features. The same warmth his Kongnam classmates described. The same warmth that, years later, would make millions of fans feel like they personally knew him even though they'd never been in the same room. But perhaps the most striking confession from the women in Jin's orbit came not from his university years or his scouting story, but from the women who worked alongside him at HYBE during the years when BTS sat at the absolute zenith of global fame. Female staff members, stylists, managers, coordinators, makeup artists, the invisible army of professionals who keep the idol machine running, have spoken, through industry channels and anonymized accounts that fans have documented extensively, about Jin's behavior behind the scenes. And what they described cuts against virtually every expectation the entertainment industry conditions us to have about mega celebrities. Jin, they said, was the member who consistently remembered staff members' names, not just the senior people, not just the ones he worked with regularly, but the new hires, the temporary workers, the people who most idols wouldn't even register as individual human beings. He asked about their families. He brought food. When the group had long overseas schedules and the staff was exhausted, Jin, despite being equally exhausted, despite being the one performing under lights for 2 hours while they watched from the wings, would check in. Not with grand gestures. With small ones. A question. A joke timed perfectly to break the tension. A moment of eye contact that said, "I see you, and I know this is hard for you too." Female staff members specifically noted that Jin never treated the hierarchy of fame as a barrier. He didn't exist above them. He existed beside them. And in an industry where even mid-tier idols sometimes develop the kind of entitlement that makes working with them a quietly miserable experience, Jin's behavior wasn't just kind, it was anomalous. It was the kind of thing that people in the industry would mention to each other in private conversations with a tone of genuine disbelief, as if they'd encountered something that shouldn't logically exist in the ecosystem they'd spent their careers navigating. Number 1 RM. The confession that proved the leader carries the heaviest silence. Every empire needs a voice. Every revolution needs someone willing to stand at the front and speak when everyone else is too afraid, too tired, or too unsure of the right words. In BTS, that person has always been Kim Namjoon. From the very first press conference where 7 unknown boys from a company nobody had heard of sat behind microphones and tried to convince a skeptical industry that they deserved to exist, it was Namjoon who spoke. When BTS stood on the stage at the United Nations General Assembly in September 2018, addressing world leaders about the importance of self-love and youth empowerment, delivering the Speak Yourself speech that would be quoted in classrooms, therapy sessions, and graduation ceremonies around the globe, it was Namjoon who spoke. When Western interviewers asked the questions, when Billboard needed a quote, when the Grammy committee needed a face, when the Korean government needed a cultural ambassador, it was always Kim Namjoon. And for years, armies celebrated this. They praised his eloquence. They marveled at his self-taught English, acquired not through tutors or academies, but through obsessively watching Friends as a teenager in Ilson. They shared his philosophical musings, his book recommendations, his museum visits, his ability to articulate complex emotions in 2 languages with equal precision. Namjoon was the bridge, the translator, the diplomat, the leader, and everyone loved him for it. But the women who stood close enough to see what that role actually costs, close enough to watch the bridge bear the weight of every crossing, they saw something that the admiration obscured. They saw the loneliness. And when they spoke about it, it didn't just shock armies. It fundamentally altered the way millions of people understood what leadership really means. It starts with his mother. The woman who, before the world had any claim on Kim Namjoon, had her own vision of who her son would become. Namjoon wasn't just smart, he was exceptional. An IQ of 148, consistently ranked in the top 1% of national academic assessments, the kind of student that the Korean education system, a system built on the almost religious sanctification of academic achievement, holds up as its greatest success story. His mother was a woman who understood the value of that trajectory. A top university, a prestigious career, a stable, respected life built on the foundation of intellectual excellence. That was the plan. That was the promise that a 148 IQ seemed to guarantee. And then her son came home and told her he wanted to rap. Not as a hobby, not as a phase, as his life. He wanted to abandon the path that Korean society had laid out for him, the path his test scores had earned, the path his family had invested in, and chase underground hip-hop, a world that offered no security, no respectability, and no guarantee that talent would be rewarded with anything other than empty rooms and broken promises. And his mother's initial reaction, as Namjoon himself has shared in interviews over the years, was not supportive. It was fear, resistance. The specific kind of maternal anguish that comes from watching your child choose a road that every rational indicator suggests leads nowhere. She fought him on it. Not out of cruelty or control, but out of love filtered through the only framework. She had a framework where safety meant degrees and stability meant salaries and success meant measurable, institutional recognition. She was terrified. But here's where the confession deepens into something that transcends a simple story of a parent coming around. Because Namjoon's mother didn't just eventually accept his choice, she eventually understood what it cost him. And the words she shared, through the channels that Korean families allow, indirect, private, filtered through relatives and close family friends whose accounts have reached the public through the intricate web of fan documentation and media coverage, painted a picture of her son that Army had never fully reckoned with. She described a boy who, even as a teenager, carried burdens that no child should have to carry. Not just the burden of his own ambitions, but the burden of feeling responsible for everyone around him. When Namjoon became the leader of a group of trainees at Big Hit, a role he didn't choose, but that was assigned to him because he was the most articulate, the most mature, the most capable of holding disparate personalities together. His mother watched her son's shoulders bend under a weight that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with people. He would come home during trainee days and she would see it. The exhaustion that wasn't physical. The worry that wasn't about choreography or vocal lessons, but about whether the other members were okay, whether the group would survive, whether he was leading well enough, whether his decisions were right. She saw a teenager performing the emotional labor of an adult, and she couldn't do anything about it except watch and hold space for whatever he was willing to share. Which, increasingly, was very little, because the leader who speaks for everyone eventually learns to stop speaking for himself. And this is where the confessions from other women in Namjoon's professional life converge into a pattern so consistent it stops being anecdotal and becomes testimony. Female journalists who interviewed BTS, particularly international journalists from Western outlets who spent extended time with the group during tours, press junkets, and promotional cycles, began noticing something about Namjoon that rarely made it into the published articles, but was discussed extensively in industry circles. He was tired. Not tired in the way that all touring musicians are tired, the generic fatigue of jet lag and schedules, and not enough sleep. Tired in a specific, structural way that was unique to his position. Female interviewers described watching Namjoon in real time during group interviews, and what they observed was a man performing multiple cognitive and emotional tasks simultaneously with a fluency that was both impressive and deeply unsettling once you understood what it required. He was listening to the interviewer's question in English. He was mentally translating it into Korean for the members who needed it. He was formulating his own answer while simultaneously anticipating which member might want to contribute and how to create space for them. He was monitoring the tone of the conversation, adjusting his energy to match the mood, scanning for potential misunderstandings or cultural landmines that could become headlines if mishandled. He was doing all of this in real time, without notes, without a teleprompter, without the safety net of a translator, because he was the translator. He was the safety net. And the women who watched this process up close described a level of mental load that would break most professional diplomats, let alone a 20-something musician sitting on a press room couch. So here we are. 7 members. 7 confessions. 7 women who stood close enough to see what the rest of the world only gets to imagine. And if you've stayed from the very first second of this list to this final moment, then you already feel it, that quiet shift in perspective that happens when you stop looking at BTS as icons and start seeing them as people. Real, complicated, beautifully imperfect people. 7 men. 7 stories told by the women who saw what we couldn't. And the common thread running through every single confession isn't scandal. It isn't gossip. It isn't drama. It's humanity. Raw, unfiltered, unglamorous humanity. The kind that reminds us that behind every record-breaking album, every sold-out stadium, every headline and hashtag and historic first, there are human beings navigating the same fears, insecurities, sacrifices, and quiet acts of courage that all of us face. They just do it under a spotlight that never turns off. So the next time you watch a BTS performance, the next time you stream a track, the next time you scroll past a photo of one of these 7 men, remember what the women closest to them confessed. Not because it changes the music, but because it changes the way you hear it. This has been Confessions of Women Close to BTS members. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Which confession shocked you the most? We'll see you in the next one.